Are you thinking of dumping your 35mm cameras and getting into medium format? Let me tell you some of the mistakes that I've made over the years. My name is Rob Skeoch, and I've been shooting black and white film for over 50 years and worked over 45 years as a professional photographer, shooting for decades for Major League Baseball and the NFL, and I've been published everywhere from Sports Illustrated to National Geographic. Maybe some of the techniques that I use will be useful to you as you learn film photography. So let's jump right in. Why do you even want medium format? The reason? The bigger negative. When you're in the darkroom, you always want a bigger negative. If you've been out shooting and enjoying the features of 35mm and the lightness and compactness of 35mm and how great it is, those are all great features while you're shooting. But in the darkroom, you wish you had a bigger negative. Could it have been a 6x7, a 645, a 4x5 negative? Your final prints will have finer grain, probably better sharpness, and probably better shadow detail. The bigger negative is hard to beat. So I've had medium format for years and have made a lot of mistakes on what cameras to use and why I tried this one and why I tried that one. So I'm going to run over them, and I'm going to just, should have ran over some of them. Anyways, I'm going to run over them and kind of tell you what the advantages are and what the disadvantages are. Now, these were cameras that I used, so there's a few missing, but these are the cameras that I've used over the years. When I was in high school, I had a part-time job working at a newspaper, and I reported high school sports scores. There was a full-time photographer there who I kind of watched and learned from, and one of the things I found out about him was he did a lot of freelance work. So the newspaper was based on 35mm. He shot 35mm for the newspaper. But as a freelance job, he always shot medium format. This was sort of the first time I'd heard of it. And he happened to use a Pentax 6.7, but a lot of the freelance work he was doing was aerials. So maybe that was the best camera at the time. So my first medium format was actually the Mamiya 645. They came out with a couple different versions. I had the original one, top shutter speed of a 500th of a second. And they came out with one with a top shutter speed of 1,000th, and then the J version, and then a bunch of other more modern versions. But I had the original one, and when I went to college for photography, that was one of the cameras that I had to use at college. Now, my college program was based on large format. The whole first year was large format, and then the second year we started to shoot a little bit of medium format and some 35. So I had the Mamiya 645, and I ended up probably over the years with maybe 4 lenses, and I actually had the power winder as well. So it was a good camera and a good camera to start off with. I have no idea what the other models after it were like. This was in the 70s. Now these cameras would be getting pretty old, and I'm not sure I would recommend it. I'll tell you what was great about it. It was inexpensive and I could afford it, and it had that 645 negative, which gave me 15 frames on a roll of 120. Now there were also some disadvantages which came back to haunt you. Disadvantage 1, the flash sync. It did not have copal shutter lenses. I think there was maybe a couple copal shutter lenses you could buy, but the basic camera itself was not a copal shutter, which limited your flash sync, and that becomes important when you're doing portraits and shooting outside. That's the one flaw. The next flaw was it didn't have interchangeable film backs. So it was a kind of an insert system where you drop this insert in, but you could not mid-roll change. And I think those are kind of features that I kept coming back to. So anyways, my first camera, Mamiya 645. Now, while I was in college, I got a part-time job in the summer between years at a studio, and the studio was based on the Mamiya RB67. So I actually shot with the RB67 a bit as well in those early years. Now, the 6.7 was a big, heavy, pig-like camera. Not super bright through the waist level finder, but it was adequate. But it did have interchangeable backs, and it did have a copal shutters, which allowed you full range of shutter speeds with flash. So the studio had the RB67. I worked there 2 summers. It was a great camera. Wasn't a system that I ever bought into, but I did have a lot of experience on it. It was a good camera, and it was updated to the RZ67, which just incorporated a lot more modern features. Now, around this time, I had a friend who asked me to shoot his wedding. I wasn't really in the wedding business, but he asked me to shoot his wedding, and I'd already gotten rid of my medium format, so he had one, and he just had me shoot his wedding on that. He gave it to me a week or two before his wedding to kind of get practiced up. And it was, interestingly, it was the Fuji GS 645. So again, it shot a 645 negative, probably 15, maybe 16 shots on a roll, I can't remember. And it was a camera, a folder, popped out with the Bellows. Now, I have always loved this camera. It shot as the main format, vertical 645. Now, I have always loved this camera, but if you have one, tell me, how has it been holding up? I've heard that the Bellows start to get light leaks and it's a little bit fragile and it hasn't held up over the years, but I have not used one for years, and it would be a camera I would be interested in getting because it's so small when it's folded up that you could really travel with it. Now, the GS came out with a 75mm lens and the Bellows and rangefinder focus. There was also a camera with a 60mm lens that didn't fold. So maybe those have held up a little better because they don't have the folding Bellows. And there was also a model with a 45mm lens that I didn't even think it had a rangefinder focus. You just kind of guesstimation focus with that one. But anyways, if you've used those cameras recently, just let me know, how do they hold up? I'm just curious. I wouldn't mind getting one of those folders. Now, as time went on early in my career, I got a job at a government studio, and they had a big budget for photography, and they had a big budget for camera gear. And they used the camera, the Pentax 6.7. And I would say they had maybe 5 people on staff. They probably had 6 or 8 or maybe 10 of the Pentax 6.7s. They'd been using them for years. They had the first ones, they had the updates, they had all the lenses, they had all the accessories, because over the years, as they got their budget, they could just add more and more. They even had the 6.7 Bellows system. So they were really committed to the Pentax 6.7. And I'll tell you, that was a workhorse camera. I always loved them. I think the 6.7 version 2 would be the one to get. But that camera, as big and bulky as it is, produced a great 6x7 negative. You could really make great prints. And we used that in a commercial studio, and it was flawless. We never had service issues. They were super well built. The only problem with them is they didn't have interchangeable film backs, and they had the slow flash sync. However, we were in the studio, so the flash sync didn't really matter. Everything was studio, and we were shooting products anyways. And the interchangeable backs didn't really matter because we had so many cameras. If you needed to change film, you would just grab another camera off the shelf. So kind of a unique situation. But I always liked the Pentax 6.7. So after being out of school for a couple of years, I got another job at a newspaper. And this newspaper was interesting. They had color on the section fronts for the newspaper. So because there was color ads on the back sections, that meant there were color on the front sections. That was the only place in the newspaper that really they had color. And the interesting thing about this newspaper, and it was a chain of papers, and they probably, throughout the chain, there was probably 100 photographers, over 100 probably working. But for the section fronts, you had to shoot transparencies. Now that might seem kind of weird to have to shoot transparencies, but the photographers were just a cog in this machine, and the machine was run by the pressmen. So the pressmen wanted transparencies to get higher quality, and they wanted them on 2 1/4. They wanted medium format. So if you worked at this newspaper and whatever was going to be on the front, you had to shoot it on medium format. So we never had spot news on the front. And the section fronts, they were never spot news. They were always controlled situations shot on medium format on Ektachrome 100 plus. So the newspaper itself had a Hasselblad 500 cm. It was a bit older. They had the camera with a prism on it and 3 lenses. And the photographers were supposed to share this one camera. So when you were going out to shoot something and you thought it was going to be the front for the section front, you would grab the kit with the Hasselblad in it. So the head photographer had his own Hasselblad system, and one of the other photographers had their own medium format kit. So basically myself and another photographer, we split this kit. And you could count on whenever you were at something important that the other guy would have the medium format camera. So you'd have to radio him and get the camera and shoot the pictures because it had to be medium format on 100 Ektachrome. A little bit tough to shoot. Now, while I was at this paper, I decided I was going to buy my own medium format. I'd had the Mamiya, gotten rid of it. I'd used the Fuji, it was nice. I'd used the Pentax 6.7, it was nice. But there was a system out there that I thought was amazing, amazing. Turned out to be a nightmare. I thought it would be amazing. It was the Rollei 6006. On paper, probably the finest medium format camera that I have ever used, the Rollei 6006. Now, there was a cheaper version called the 6002, and then they came out with the 6006. That's where I came into the picture. And then they came out with a 6008, which kind of corrected some of the mistakes from the 6006 that I had. So this used Zeiss lenses, so the lenses were supposed to be good, and the camera design was magnificent. Interchangeable backs, full copal shutter. You would actually plug the PC plug, your flash, into the camera body. It would still sync with the lenses, which was amazing. But if you change lenses, you didn't have to, switch that plug around because it was plugged into the camera. So this was, on paper, a fantastic camera. Here's where the problems came up with the Rollei 6006. Now, if you have a Rollei 6006, your mileage may vary from mine, but for me, it became a nightmare. 2 reasons. I took it in for service. I just wasn't getting sharp pictures. I took it in for service and basically started almost a fist fight between the 2 service techs. One was saying that the ground glass had to go a certain way, frosted side up. And the other guy was adamant, no, it's frosted side down. So I ended up just giving my camera back, you guys fight it out. I would just have to go home and experiment, shoot some with the ground glass in one way and then flip it around and see which ones were sharper. I couldn't believe the 2 techs couldn't even agree on this. It was craziness. That was my first indication that this was not a perfect system. So this is where the real nightmare started. A photographer friend asked me to shoot his wedding. He worked at a newspaper. Could I shoot his wedding? I wasn't really a wedding photographer, but sure, I'll shoot his wedding. So imagine this. I'm at the back of the church and the bride is about to walk down the aisle. This would be considered a key time in wedding photography. The bride's going to walk down the aisle. You're going to want to get a picture of this. So just before she walks down, I say, hold on, I'm just going to grab a quick portrait. And I take the picture and the mirror flaps up and it just keeps flapping. And then it breaks off. So now the bride is going to walk down the aisle and my camera, the mirror has just broken off. So hold on, let me run to the car and get my backup 35 mil, and I shot the rest of the wedding with 35 mil. That was probably, I got the camera fixed, but I sold it right after that. I mean, it was unbelievable. I've never heard of the mirror breaking off of a camera before. Anyways, the Rollei 6006, your mileage hopefully was better than mine, but I used it for a short period of time and I got rid of it. I just couldn't trust it. So as I mentioned, I shot the rest of that wedding on 35 mil. Shooting a wedding on 35 mil, unheard of at the time. It's not like now where people wouldn't even think about it. But back then, if you were a wedding photographer, you were shooting on medium format. I only knew of one photographer who shot weddings on 35 mil, and he printed everything on canvas so that the canvas texture would kind of break up the unsharpness and the graininess from the film. He could kind of cover it by shooting on canvas. Anyways, if you were doing weddings, you were doing medium format. Really, if you were doing freelance, you were doing medium format. That's just how it was back then. Things changed, but it's not like that now. So I decided to get rid of this Rollei and I buy a Pentax 645. Now I was working full-time at a newspaper, so I was doing some freelance, and the Pentax was going to be fine for what I was doing. I liked it. It was a great camera. It still kind of brought me back to the 2 problems. The flash sync wasn't right across the shutter speed range and not interchangeable backs. Again, it had that cassette drop in, but you couldn't mid-roll change, which I think is kind of important. So I did have the Pentax 645 for a few years. So I had the Pentax 645, but I was shooting less medium format. And now this is where the sickness gets in your head. I always liked the Rolleis. Oh yeah, I just had a nightmare experience with the Rolleis, but I thought, no, I'm gonna go back to Rollei. So I bought a camera that I loved, the Rollei T. So medium format. The T was a cheaper version of the Rollei, and the F was the king of the Rollei twin lens, and the T was a cheap man's version. And you know what? It was amazing. I bought it off eBay. I bought a really clean one. It was flawless. I used it for a few years. I should never have sold it. I don't know why I sold it. But the Rollei T certainly would be one camera that I wish I had kept. Regret selling it. And it was great. Now, maybe the Rollei F is better. I don't know. The Rollei T was perfect for what I was doing, which was portraits with it. So after having one nightmare experience with Rollei and then having the Rollei T, which I sold and immediately regretted, I thought, all right, I'll update that and I'll get the Rollei GX. So the Rollei GX, again, a twin lens with a standard lens. It was sort of one of the later versions of the Rollei, and it was great, except I bought it off eBay and sold it on eBay. It had issues. The waist level finder, when it popped up, it didn't really align perfectly, and you always had to hold your finger on it a little bit to get it to line up so that you could focus properly. So great camera, took great portraits, nice and sharp, but mine was just a little bit out of alignment. Probably I could have got that service somewhere, I don't know. I eventually sold it off. So I had a few Rolleis. I had the T that I loved, regretted selling. The GX was great, but kind of moved it along after a while. So about this time, I've left the newspaper industry and I'm shooting sports full-time. So I'm shooting Major League Baseball. That would be a Nikon with a 400-2.8 and a 600 f4. I was shooting the NFL, again, Nikon with a 400-2.8 and a 600 f4. And I started to get interest in shooting NBA. So I went to some NBA games and you could shoot them on 35mm, but the photographers who were charging the big bucks were shooting them on medium format. Let me explain. So you might have a Nikon in your lap, you know, with a 70-200 or maybe a 300-2.8, and that would be in your lap. Now, these are strobe photos, so the arena has strobes mounted in the roof that you can rent for the game. It was about $400 US per game to rent the strobes. And the strobes just provide enough power so you could shoot Ektachrome 100 on a Hasselblad, ideally. So the photographers who were making, let's call it the big bucks, shooting NBA, they were shooting with the Nikon in their lap on strobes, and they would mount Hasselblads around the arena. So I started to buy Hasselblads. They were the 553, so that's the bigger one with the motor on the bottom, and you would attach a remote to it so you could fire it remotely. Maybe you were hardwiring that in, or maybe you're using like a Pocket Wizard or something like that. The first one I bought was a 553 and a 60mm lens, and you would mount it right below the basket on the post, we called it. So you would mount that on the post, and then I bought a second 553 with a 250 Hasselblad lens. Bought that lens. The camera was used, but the lens was new, and the 60 I bought was new. And the 250 you would kind of mount over to the side a bit. There was usually a stairwell, and you would kind of clamp it in this area where the public weren't allowed to go. Fire that with a remote, and it would fire the strobes and take the picture. And then as things got more exciting, I bought a 40mm lens, and the 40mm lens, again, a third Hasselblad 553, so now I have three of them. And the 40mm lens was kind of mounted behind the basket, so you're shooting through the glass at the basket. You can see a couple of the photos here, what that looks like. So that was with the 40. So that was kind of what I was doing with the Hasselblads. I had the 40 through the glass, I had the 250 on another body from the side, and I had the 60 on the post. And of those three angles, the through the glass was the most dynamic. But they were all important, and it just helped you get a little bit more work because you were providing three camera angles plus whatever was in your lap with the 35mm. I did know a couple of photographers who shot Hasselblad in their lap, but I needed autofocus for the most part for that. But they were shooting with maybe an 80, again, on strobes with a Hasselblad. So around this time, I was starting to evolve out of shooting sports. I got hired by Sony to be part of their imaging team. And the Hasselblad system that I had built, as great as it was just sitting there unused. And as a photographer, never a collector, photographers, I think, have to sell their gear, their older gear, to finance the newer gear. So I don't think a lot of photographers have that old gear still that they've kept. Oh, this was my first camera, this was my second camera. I think generally people had to trade that in against the price of the new stuff. So I had this Hasselblad system, and I wasn't really using it. I was working at Sony, and I just kind of started to sell it off and got rid of it. That was probably a mistake. I should have kept the Hasselblad system. I bought the lenses new, so it would have been nice to have kept those. So I'm at Sony. They never made film cameras. Everything was digital, but I missed shooting black and white. So I rebought a Pentax 645. Now, this was the autofocus version, and I bought autofocus lenses, and that's a great system. The Pentax 645 autofocus, I really like it. And if I was shooting African wildlife in black and white, I would use the Pentax 645 because it has a few longer lenses, has a 600 and things like that. So Pentax 645 autofocus, I thought it was quite good. I used that for a number of years, and the lenses are fantastic, great sharp images. Now, as I left Sony, I decided that I was probably done with the Pentax, and I sold that off. Like I said, I have used a lot of cameras and have made a lot of mistakes. So anyways, I had the Pentax 645 autofocus. I sold that off, but I still needed something to do portraits with. And there was a camera that I always loved, had never seen one, but always loved in theory. And again, it's a Rollei twin lens with the telephoto lens. So Rollei actually had a camera with a normal lens. Now the lenses were not interchangeable. So if you wanted wide angle, you bought a Rollei with a wide angle lens. And if you wanted telephoto, you bought the Rollei FT. So there's been 3 versions of the Rollei telephoto over the decades. And I bought the FT version, which was the final version. So this would be kind of version 3. And it's just corrected some of the other issues that the cameras have had, mostly with focus distance. So my current medium format, I only have the one, is the Rollei FT, and I use it for portraits. That's what I like to shoot. I shoot a lot of portraits. I'm doing that whole rodeo cowboy scene with portraits of the cowboys, kind of building a little studio outside the corral at the rodeo, and I shoot that with the Rollei FT. This has been an amazing camera. Is it a perfect camera? No, but it is an amazing camera. So that kind of gets you up to date on maybe the 9 or so camera systems that I've used in medium format. There was a couple that I've missed that I'm just going to mention. Now, it's a funny world out there. Everything is available online, but in the day, if a camera store didn't stock or sell these cameras, you wouldn't know anything about them. And a couple of cameras that kind of came and went without a bunch of fanfare were like the Mamiya 6, the Mamiya 7. Now, I knew Mary Ellen Mark. She was shooting with the Mamiya, but I didn't know a lot of other people shooting with it, and they were great cameras, but not that popular around where I was. So maybe the Mamiya 6 or the Mamiya 7 would be they're kind of like a rangefinder medium format. They would be interesting. Fuji actually made some 6x9 kind of like Texas rangefinder type thing. So big rangefinders, you know, a little bit loud. Mothers would grab their children off the street when the shutter went off, things like that. So Fuji had some 6x9s that were very popular, very well made, and produced that big 6x9 negative. So there's the Mamiyas, the Fuji 6x9. There was Voigtlander actually made a 6.67, so you could shoot it 6x6 or 6x7. Again, kind of a folding camera. You know, in parts of the world it was labeled as a Fuji, but in other parts of the world it was labeled as a Voigtlander. That would be a modern folding camera with a rangefinder focus, a great sharp lens, and a meter in it. So that would be worth considering, especially if you're going to travel. Now, what do you do with all this knowledge from nightmares and mistakes and having shot with cameras that I worked at studios and having owned systems? Where would you go with that? Well, my current camera is the simplest system because it doesn't have interchangeable lenses. It has no accessories. That's the Rollei Telephoto. I wouldn't recommend this though. It's perfect for what I do, but it wouldn't be what I would recommend. With all of my knowledge or wisdom or whatever it is that we call our mistakes, what I would buy actually would be the Hasselblad 555. Now that's the Hasselblad with the motor on the bottom. That's the last version of the motorized Hasselblad system. And you know why I would buy it? Fantastic camera, had all the Hasselblad features, but is not near as expensive as the 503, which was the last version of the manual wind camera. So you can get all of the cool features that were updated over the years and get them in a 555, and it's cheaper than buying the non-motorized version. When these cameras came out, they were $5 grand. They are, you know, a tenth of that now. So what I would buy, the 555, I probably would just use it with the waist level finder. It's a square anyways, there's no vertical or horizontal. I'd buy a 80mm lens with it. I'd get a 120 macro, great for shorter portraits. I'd get a 180, call that your portrait lens. I'd get a 50. That would be my 4 lens system on the Hasselblad 555. Oh, I know, it uses batteries. You know what? Throw 5 extra AA's in your bag and you can do all the shooting you're going to want to need to do. So that's what I would suggest. That's the camera I would buy if I was doing it all again. Trust me, I have made so many mistakes. I've had so many nightmares over medium format gear. I haven't tried all the systems, but I've tried enough of them to realize that, you know, maybe just go with the Hasselblad that everyone recommended all along, all the years. Right from college, people said, you should buy a Hasselblad, you should buy a Hasselblad. You know what you should buy? You should probably buy a Hasselblad. Just saying, your experience may be different. Our mileage may vary. I've had some great cameras. There's a few that I regret selling. There's a few that I couldn't sell fast enough. Just saying.